Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Saturday. It's February 22nd. Today is day 505. The atrocities in the West Bank and the resistance there continues today on this 22nd day of February. In the year 2025, Israeli forces have set up hundreds of checkpoints across the occupied territory since the start of their offensive there on the 21st of January. At least 70 Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli military during that time. There's been widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure in local communities by the Israeli troops. As I addressed yesterday in my daily update, Israel is gearing up for an intensive operation in the occupied West Bank after bombs detonated on 3 empty buses in central Israel in a parking depot on Thursday night. The work of armed groups who claimed those bombings, but there were no casualties, according to Israeli media. Of course, today, being Saturday, was the final of the Phase 1 live prisoner exchange for Palestinian prisoners and Israeli hostages. 5 hostages were freed in the first part of this exchange, and then a 6th hostage was exchanged later. Shortly before 10 a.m. local time in the Middle East in Gaza, 2 Israeli hostages, Tal Shoham, 40 years old, Avera Mengistu, 39, were released during a staged event in Rafah in Gaza. And then after 12:30 p.m. local time, 3 more hostages, Aliyah Cohen, 27, Omer Shem Tov, 22, and Omer Wenkert, 23, were released in similar conditions. They were flanked by armed and masked Hamas members. And around 9:30 a.m. In the East Coast, which is roughly, I think, 7 hours difference, it was reported that the 6th hostage, Hisham al-Sayed, arrived in Israel after having been handed over to the Red Cross in Gaza, according to the IDF. So the release of Israeli hostages in Gaza for the first time today was done in 3 different locations on the same day. Now, the final handover of Hisham al-Sayed was done differently. He's an Arab Israeli, a Bedouin from a community in the Negev. He had been held in captivity in Gaza for 10 years. I talked about him a bit earlier this week. He'd crossed over on his own in 2015. His family mentioned he was having a mental crisis at the time. Unlike all of the other hostage handovers that Hamas had conducted so far, in highly stage-managed events, Hisham al-Sayed was handed over to the Red Cross without a public ceremony in Gaza City. Hamas did not explain why. He was the first Arab Israeli to be freed. The Israeli media reported that his release was carried out in private out of respect for the Arab community in Israel to which he belongs. I suppose that that's speculation. In return, at the time of this writing, Israel was set to free 602 Palestinian prisoners and detainees. There were buses waiting at Over prison, according to media reports. This was the largest release in one go since the ceasefire began, in part because Palestinians were not released on Thursday when the dead hostages' bodies were returned to Israel. Now, we're going to see about 400 prisoners who have been detained by Israel since the 7th of October. There was also a great upsurge in the number of Palestinians taken by Israel after October 7th. There will be also more than 100 released who were sentenced to either lifelong sentences or very long sentences for the most serious offenses that are released in those who are set to be released today. This includes the killing of Israelis. Of the 602 prisoners supposed to be released today, 50 were serving life sentences, 60 had long sentences, according to Palestinian authorities. 47 prisoners were re-arrested after the Shalit deal in 2011. That was a deal to free the captured Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. It's important to note that 445 people were detained in Gaza after October 7th. They will also be released. This will include the longest-serving prisoners, Nael Barghouti, who spent 45 years in jail. He was jailed in 1978 for killing an Israeli bus driver. Since the October 7th attack, the number of Palestinian detainees has doubled to around 10,000 people. So questions as of this morning did remain over the handling of the remains of Shiri Abbas, who was brought home last night after a different body was returned on Thursday that was not hers. In response, Hamas said there could have been an error or a mix-up due to Israeli airstrikes. There were questions about why they did not provide her genuine remains initially and how they got them so quickly afterwards. They did not provide an explanation. BBC said Hamas was not the Palestinian armed faction that abducted Shiri Abbas or her children, nor did they believe that Hamas was the ones that held them afterwards, which could suggest that Hamas did not have full command of the process of the handover of her body. And perhaps they did not make the necessary checks. Again, that's all speculation. There's also the possibility that Hamas did not knowingly give them the wrong body, but again, it's not known. And then the other question is, why would they do such a provocative act when the ceasefire is already in such a fragile state? But this exchange also will be followed this next Thursday. There's supposed to be 4 additional hostages of deceased Israelis that will be returned to Israel, in addition to more Palestinian prisoners and detainees released. My understanding is this Thursday is the last of the first phase, and that the first phase of the ceasefire agreement will be brought to an end. So this morning, the family of Shiri Abbas confirmed that they do have her body. It was returned to Israel, that she was killed in Gaza. Of course, that whole incident sparked significant anger in Israel and the accusations that Hamas has violated the ceasefire deal. So we're coming to an end of the 6-week phase that saw a minimum, or was supposed to see 33 Israeli hostages freed. It has done that. 1,900 Palestinian prisoners and detainees from Israeli jails. Other agreed upon elements of phase 1 included Israeli forces leaving populated areas, hundreds of aid lorries being permitted into Gaza. Stage 2 is aimed at establishing a permanent ceasefire. It has still not yet begun. The remains of living hostages in Gaza, there's said to be at least 30, are supposed to be exchanged for more prisoners in phase 2, and the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. Foreign Minister Sahar of Israel said on Tuesday that negotiations were supposed to happen this past week. They did not start. And third and final stage of negotiations, if we ever get there, would see the remains of all of the final dead hostages returned to Israel and the reconstruction of Gaza beginning. Saudi is supposed to host a gathering of Arab countries on Friday. Yesterday, we talked about that some yesterday after remarks this past month from Trump about the Gaza, people being displaced, turning the enclave into a Riviera. Leaders from Jordan and Israel were set to join Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, the UAE. As I mentioned, those talks began, and many in the world see this as a sign of hope, as an alternative plan for the Trump initiative. An update on the Armenian Patriarchate in Jerusalem. I wanted to be sure that you heard about this. The patriarchs and the heads of churches of Jerusalem put out a statement standing in solidarity with the Armenian Patriarchate as a foreclosure was issued earlier this week against the properties in Jerusalem that could make the land vulnerable to sale. Rights groups have argued that Jewish settler agencies are set to purchase the property, which, if it is sold, the Armenian quarter has been a part of the Christian presence in Jerusalem for centuries, which would erode the Christian character, of the multi-faith aspect of Jerusalem. I wrote an open letter to Secretary of State Rubio yesterday, which will publish soon, that churches for Middle East Peace put out a statement in support of the Christians of Jerusalem and affirming the heads of churches' statement as well, and the Patriarchate of the Armenian Church. I'll share more about that in coming days. I'm spending this weekend with my grandson. His name is Leo. He's about 6 weeks old. He was born the 2nd of January. And I spent a few hours with him early this morning, which is the greatest of privileges. And he was asleep on my chest, and I was praying for him and for all of the children who've been killed over the last 505 days. More than 13,000 of them, thousands of them unknown. They don't know how many children have died. Is it 13,000 or 15 or more? And we waited so eagerly for Leo for months and then weeks and then the days of when he would come. And every day he brings so much joy and life and hope. and every Palestinian child that has been lost in Gaza, in the West Bank. I prayed for those that have been lost and for those who are still alive, that they might have a future without occupation and when their future looks so uncertain. And I prayed for the Babas children and all of the Israeli children whose lives have been lost, and for Israeli children and for the children of that nation and people, be they Jewish or Palestinian or Ethiopian or Druze or Thai, and that the Jewish children of Israel would be raised to be makers of peace and not war, and that the children of that nation would have a future of peace and security and not paying the cost of their ancestors or parents or grandparents, that we might seek to right the wrongs that have gone before all of us. May we work for a better future for our children and our grandchildren and their children's children. May that give us hope as we continue and seek to endure and remain steadfast in our efforts towards peace. Might Christ go before us. In his name, amen.